Going live in 3, 2, and 1. Greetings and a warm welcome to episode 4 of both Sides Now. This is 观望东西，聆听左右. We welcome RP to join us in conversation today on our topic of the Chinese in Singapore. So what makes Singapore a particularly unique study of the Chinese diaspora is that nowhere else outside the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China do Chinese form the majority of the citizens of the nation state and hold the majority of positions at the highest levels of government. But first, some demographics and information about Singapore. Singapore is 42 kilometers from east to west and 23 kilometers from north to south. It's a small yet densely populated city-state with a multicultural society. As of 2020, if the numbers are correct, Singapore's population was around 5.69 million people, broken down into 4 distinct ethnic groups: the Chinese, the Malays, the Indians, and others. I'm currently based in Australia, and it's been a number of years since I've gone back to Singapore. RP, you're currently based in Singapore in Zambawang, I believe, in the northern areas. Can you tell us a little bit more about your life in Zambawang, Singapore?
What's there to say? It's a typical Singaporean life. But choosing to live to the locals, living in Zambawang is more or less living in the middle of nowhere. Because 20 years ago, Zambawang basically is home to almost nothing except for our shipyards. And originally, this area was a British naval base back in the colonial days. So yeah, it wasn't really developed until very, very recently, in the last 20, 30 years. Before that, it was all farmland, swampland, a naval base and a shipyard, and that's all there is to Zambawang back in the days. And that was my idea and my understanding of Zambawang before I moved up here. So yeah, but it's been one of the better choices I've made moving up here from the east.
It's a beautiful area, man. I've visited a number of times. It looks so awesome, the park.
You are one of the few people that would appreciate that. Most people would just say that this is so out of the way. I mean, just to give you an illustration, every town in Singapore will have the bus interchange, right? And you have many, many buses. So the entirety of Zambawang has got the last time I counted was 5 bus services connecting Zambawang to the rest of the country. Yeah. You have 5 bus lines in the interchange at Zambawang. So maybe people overseas might not understand this, but you as another fellow Singaporean, you will see how weird that is actually.
Yeah, I'm contrasting it to my experience growing up in Bedok, which is in the east.
You're Bedokian as well?
I've been a long time ago, when I was, I think approximately from the age of 5 to when I was about 13, lived in Bedok.
I spent most of my life in Bedok. I grew up in Bedok.
Wow. Okay.
I grew up in Bedok North.
Crossover action there.
Yeah, I grew up in Bedok North. I can actually walk over to some of our common friends' place actually back in the day. But hey,
Bedok North. So that's very close. We also was at Bedok Reservoir.
Oh, just one main road down. So the main road that connects Bedok Reservoir to Bedok North is I actually live just beside that main junction.
Yeah.
So from Bedok Reservoir, when you turn into Bedok North, you have to go past this primary school, go under the expressway, and then past a temple. After a temple, that junction, that's where I live. So
wow,
yeah, very close to
it's
where you
really close by.
Wow, I knew you for 20 years and we didn't.
And now we're finding this out for the first time.
So
despite the fact it's such a small country.
So imagine, dear viewers out there, imagine even between 2 people who's known each other for 20 years, we still find out things like this. And we both grew up in a very small country that's
42 kilometers east to west
and 27
and 23 kms
23
from north to south. 23, I think, if I'm not wrong. 23, 22.
There should be a 7 in there somewhere. Should be 42
Yeah.
east to west, 27 north to south, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, because I'm quite keenly aware of that number because the last time I visited Zambawang Park,
Yeah.
I went on a massive walk from Marina Bay Sands. Where is that? No, Marina Bay Sands, then there's the waterfront. What's that area called? The Barrage.
Oh,
Marina Barrage. I woke up really early one morning and decided to just go for a long walk. Started from Marina Barrage and ended up in Zambawang. And yep, that was pretty interesting journey ending up at Zambawang.
well, I only remember I had a friend once
Yeah.
walk from Bedok to Yishun.
What?
Took
Well,
him,
that's across the country, like diagonally across.
took him about 5 hours. But I mean, it's
5 hours.
still not as bad as you walking from the barrage all the way up to Zambawang. Right? It's literally like point to point on the island.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The distance felt okay. Like I was looking at the distance, like okay, if I cover like 2 or 3 kms per hour, I should be able to get there in the same day. But I didn't really factor in the number of traffic lights and pedestrian crossings I had to go through. Once I ended up in the center of the country, so like the central catchment area, Pierce Reservoir, Merici, all that was very beautiful and easy to walk. But everywhere else, there was urbanization. Yeah, many obstacles in the way.
But you do realize that once you hit the central of Singapore, you are making a huge detour, right? Because the
Yeah, there's no easy way to cut through.
You can't cut through because the center of Singapore is basically one giant water catchment area, and you can't go through. You have to go around it. Yeah. So that's why.
So on my next trip in May, I don't know if I'm being too ambitious. The goal is to walk from Pasir Ris to somewhere in the west, maybe Jurong.
Might as well go all the way into Jurong Island, you know, if that's what you're gonna do.
If I could get the permission to do so, yeah, just really stretch it. But it's completely possible to navigate the country from one end to the other in a single day, perhaps demonstrating exactly how small the country is. All right, so I'm gonna pull up onto the screen world map, and what I've done is I've attempted to highlight the outline of Singapore because without the assistance of the highlight, it will be quite difficult to actually see the country. So I'm gonna start to zoom in a lot more, and there we go, everybody. Singapore in all its entirety, from east to west and north to south.
And disclaimer, Bob here actually put in parts of Malaysia and Johor as well. So
yeah. So what we're looking at is the Singapore island. And for the sake of reference, Zambawang up here will be somewhere along here. Up here in the northeast.
No, you see that peak right at the north there?
Yep.
Yeah,
right
yeah. That very small area there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you're really close to Johor. Like,
yeah, I am the.
Is it a swim away? Is it even possible to swim across?
I guess. I believe there are people trying to swim across on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And could you maybe tell us a little bit more about Zambawang? Because based on the map we're looking at, you can see there's a lot of greenery.
Oh, yes.
It's kind of close to Seletar Island, but there's this massive naval base, which is currently seated up here along the Straits of Johor.
Oh, yeah. These are, if I'm not wrong, these are leftovers from the colonial days. Because Zambawang, we can't really just talk about Zambawang as a Zambawang singular town. Zambawang is basically Zambawang, Admiralty, and Canberra. Canberra is a new town they just set up in between Zambawang and Yishun. But basically, the whole area of Zambawang back in the days were comprised of what is now Zambawang, Admiralty, and Canberra. And the reason why it's called Admiralty, because back in the colonial days, it was the Royal Admiralty. The Royal Navy base was situated in the area. And so that was basically the only thing in the northern tip of Singapore, because everything else in the colonial days were in the south. So the north was never developed until very recently. And when I say very recently, I mean in the past 30 years or so, 30 or 40 years. Remember, Singapore gained independence in 1965. The entire Zambawang area was not developed until, if I'm not wrong, the late 70s or the early 80s. And so we have a lot of these leftover relics from the colonial days. We have colonial buildings, we have this shipyard that's left over, we have a naval base that's left over. And currently there's this project that's going on basically, 10 minutes walk away from my place, that they are reconstructing this colonial mansion and making it into a public community space, community center kind of thing, called Bukit Sembawang. And by the way,
Sembawang.
and by the way, Sembawang is named after a plant, a mangrove plant called the Sembawang tree or the Sembawang bush. And there are still some of them around the area beside this big drain or river just beside my place. So yeah, this whole area, I mean, even when we were kids, we can come up to Zambawang and all we can see are trees and malls and even some kampongs. Kampongs, for all you viewers out there who don't know, are the Malay term for villages.
Village.
Yeah, a village. So there were still some kampongs in the area. And if I'm not wrong, one of the oldest surviving mosque in Singapore is actually in Zambawang. And you actually have to go into one of these wooded areas to see it.
Yeah, I can see that. Is this the location?
I think that's the one. Yeah, I think that's the one.
Yeah.
I think that's the one. So yeah, it's in the middle of nowhere. So back then, if I'm not wrong, there is actually surrounded by a small Malay village around it, but they've all been relocated out.
And that's Sembawang. So you're saying a lot of this was not in existence until very recently.
I mean, even the cluster of apartment blocks that I'm living in now was built in 2000. So this whole cluster that I'm staying in now, it was actually built only in year 2000. Before that, it was basically a big patch of nothing. And ever since I moved here in 2012, in the past 10 years, an entirely new residential cluster just popped up on empty land just across.
So you've seen the horizon transform.
Yes, I have literally seen the landscape transform up here for the very short 10 years that I lived here. Yeah.
And how would you contrast that to life in Bedok? Maybe we could both take a trip down memory lane and gonna start to zoom out the map, gonna bring it across. So Bedok will be somewhere here. I noticed the reservoir.
Yeah.
That used to be home for a number of years, and you were in Bedok
North. So you see the reservoir, right? Then you see PIE, right? Then there's
the PIE is underneath it.
So there's a road leading from Bedok Reservoir at the southern tip of the reservoir. There's a road that's leading straight down. Yes, this road straight down. So the first junction, this will be my block.
Yeah, so somewhere around here.
Yeah,
so really close, dude.
Yeah.
Like a 5 to 10 minute walk. I mean, there's a little bit of a park here. I think there's a linear park, I recall.
I used to go walk in the park.
Are you close to the Bak Chor Mee area? Is that
5 minutes walk away.
Wow!
I used to go there like every night from the
Stupi Bak Chor Mee?
Is
that?
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Because we eventually end up talking about food, I'm pretty sure, as we are speaking about the different Chinese groups in Singapore.
We are Singaporeans. So, what else can we talk about?
Yeah.
We're Singaporeans and we are Chinese. What else can we talk about? Of course it's food.
Yeah. And how long were you in Bedok North for? Like
from what I heard, my father was actually moving on the day I was born. So literally I lived in the Bedok apartment from the day I was born until I mean, in between I moved out a few times. But when I finally sold the place and moved up here, it was just 10 years ago. And for you viewers out there, don't need to guess, I'm 42 this year, born in 79. So yeah, I spent almost 30 years in Bedok. So yeah, but it is very, very different from living up here in Zambawang. Bedok is what we will call a mature estate that is already fully developed and going through redevelopment. Like the entire town was going through redevelopment. by the time I was moving out. And Zambawang, relatively new estate and very, very quiet. The population here is not so dense. So you still get very quiet moments up here, even when you're walking about the area. I'm sure you experienced that before. Whereas if you go to places like
you've got options to the left, to the right. There's so much nature.
And even if we walk into the town center in Zambawang, I will hardly call that crowded. Some people might disagree, but I will hardly call that crowded. If you ever lived in Bedok or Tampines, you would know what crowded
or
is.
Jurong.
Or Jurong East for that matter. You would know what crowded is. So it's quite a big difference. I mean, I was so used because I was living just next to a crossroad junction. So I was so used to vehicle noises and and you would not actually notice it when you're there, but once you're away from it, you actually notice is the smell, the traffic smells. So I did not notice it when I was living there for 30 years, but after I moved up here, I started to realize, the air smells different. And first week up here, I could not sleep because it was too quiet.
Oh, what a huge contrast.
Yeah, it was too
so
quiet.
You could hear yourself.
Yeah, I could hear myself. And back in Bedok, like I was saying, we had this, I was living at a cross junction between two main roads, basically. So all the traffic that's coming in from Bedok Reservoir side, from your side, and all the traffic that came out from the expressway will go past my place. So the traffic was crazy, and we have these motorcycle gangs that for some reason decide they want to do races at 5 in the morning for some weird reason. So 5 o'clock in the mornings, I'll get woken up by all these motorcycles revving their engines in the morning. I still remember those days.
Is it because they're close to the PIE, so they'll go on there?
I have no idea.
What's the term for it? Jia Hong, right?
Rounding. Yeah, some will call it rounding. Yeah. But,
I can see from the map. There is literally just urbanization everywhere you look.
Everywhere. And to be very honest, I went back to Bedok a few times after I moved up here because my reservist was in Bedok. So the first few times I went back, I actually got lost at Bedok Central. Like, can you imagine? I grew up, I spent my entire life there, and then when I went back, I actually got lost in the town center. Because they reconstructed everything. They redeveloped the entire town. And
the MRT station is more than meets the eye now.
Oh yeah, I mean, when I moved out, the new interchange, I think, was not even constructed.
Oh wow, okay.
They tore down the old interchange already.
Because now it's a multi-use complex, right? There's the train station, and above it, there's apartments, there's shopping.
Oh yes, big difference from when I moved out. And I mean, those are just, to me, that's a very small change. The real big change was how they actually bulldozed down some parks and dug up some areas and constructed new buildings, like the area beside the market. It is a new community club there now, Heartbeat at Bedok. If I'm not wrong, that's the one. So
Heartbeat at Bedok. Yeah, I have it right here.
That used to be a patch of empty land. It was a park.
And, oh wow! Is that the swimming pool?
No,
is that a new swimming pool?
There's a new swimming pool. The old swimming pool is if you scroll to your right, it's all the way to the right. That's where the old swimming pool and the stadium. That's now it's torn down.
The old swimming pool is gone.
It's gone.
Wow.
Yeah, and so
I remember spending many times swimming at that pool.
Walking distance from my place. If you want to see my old place, you can shift up a bit. I was at block.
Up a bit.
401 was my block. There. 401.
Okay. 401. There you go.
This block.
Right next to Bethesda.
Yeah.
My word.
I used to play basketball.
It's really close because it's just one straight road, and then to the left, and then that's my place.
Yeah.
Back then.
Yep.
Really, really close.
Really close. Really close. This Yuneng school that you see here, it used to be two schools. Yuneng and Minxin. I was a student of Minxin Primary School, and they tore that down already.
Really, Avi? I was a student there as well. I think 1 year kindergarten.
Where?
At Yuneng. Yunnan
Yunnan
Primary School.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't know if it was called Minsin.
No.
It's
Yunnan
really
means,
hazy,
we the way our system works is like usually there are two primary schools together sharing the same field. So Yunnan and Mingxing were the two primary schools that shared the same football field.
I see.
Then. But now Mingxing is torn down already. It was converted to a home for children for a while, and I think in the last couple of years it got finally torn down totally.
Yeah.
But wow, memory lane.
Wow.
Like you say.
Memory lane.
Memory lane.
And I recall some of the architecture along that road, like the temple, the red swastika school. It's all flooding back to me now.
Oh yeah.
So by having a close look at Singapore's map, what's clear is that it's an island, and islanders would typically spend a lot of time at the beach. I remember growing up and heading over to East Coast Park, Sentosa, to enjoy my time in the sun. And looking out into the horizon wasn't exactly the most romantic of perspectives, because instead of having this beautiful patch of sky in front of you, there'll be the thousands upon thousands of maritime traffic.
It's actually more busy now, if you can believe it.
Is it more busy?
Look, just look at that patch there.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just gonna go back there.
Just look at this patch to your
construction. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I mean the patch of ships to the right of the screen.
Oh yeah, you can see that.
Yeah. I mean back then
parked.
When we were kids, when we were teenagers, it was not so packed. I mean, there were ships, granted, a lot of ships, but not this much. And they are much closer to the coast now as compared to when we were younger. Like I went down to East Coast Park a couple of months back, and I was so surprised. So surprised. Like, wow, the ships are so close now. Back then they were further out, and there weren't so many of them back from my memory. And now it's like really you can really see it in a very visceral way that we are a transport hub for both the east and west, and you could literally and in a very visceral way see trade going through our country and our waters.
That's correct. Because of its unique location, seated at the confluence of trade between the Indian as well as Pacific Oceans. And just to provide another layer of perspective, I'm going to switch over to a live view of maritime traffic around Singapore as we speak.
It's madness. It's madness.
A lot of activity. Going to start to zoom out just to provide a bit more perspective into this. And you can see just how much global trade relies on this maritime passage.
I believe the only
Indian and Pacific Oceans.
I believe there's only one other port that is more busy than ours, and is I think in Hainan. Was it Hainan or Shanghai? One of the
Hainan or Shanghai
Chinese ports is. We used to be the busiest maritime port in the world for decades until the Chinese.
It was a huge part of the branding as well growing up. Yeah, we're the busiest port in the world.
Oh, is it this very busy one up here? Which one is it? There's one very.
So I'm
busy.
currently
Shenzhen.
There's Hainan there, and then we have Shenzhen over here.
Yeah. So it could be one of those Shenzhen, or could be Shenzhen that's busier than Singapore.
Yeah. Something that's worth updating to get the latest.
Yeah.
Is it Shenzhen or is it Singapore that's currently the busiest in terms of maritime traffic?
It's definitely,
so from this perspective,
definitely one of the Chinese ports. Definitely not a Singapore port anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, the amount of trade that goes through, and our own petrochem industry exports as well. So surprisingly,
the trade has been. Sorry, you go.
Yeah, surprisingly, a lot of people don't realize is that Singapore is actually a major player in the petrochem industry. We are not a resource country, but we are one of the biggest. What do you call that in Chinese? It's called 加工. How do you translate it in English? Processing. We are one of the biggest petrochem processing industry players in the industry now. So that's why we have Jurong Island.
Yeah, we can see that's Jurong Island.
Yeah, that small
the refineries.
That small corner of a small island holds like, I don't know, man, 10, 20, 30% of petrochem processing in the world. So ridiculously dense and important. So yeah, Singapore.
And what's really quite fascinating when you're looking at the map of Singapore is that originally it was not this size. Before reclamation, I think it was approximately 600 square kilometers or just under. And you can see Tuas, for instance, when I was growing up,
it was an island.
Was not this size. And it wasn't this massively developed.
Yeah, it was an island. This Jurong Island, if I'm not wrong, was 3 different islands, and they combined it together. And Tuas was an island on itself, and then they reclaimed the land and built all this infrastructure on it. Yeah, I mean, Bukom Island, Semakau Island used to be, I don't know if they are still now, but they used to be live firing islands for our military. Like basically, there's nothing there. Those islands are there. Their existence is purely for our soldiers to bombard the heck out of them.
Yeah.
So I don't know about now, but I mean, with Jurong Island so close by, I seriously don't understand how they can be setting off missiles and bombs.
It's quite close by.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, so now that we've taken a geographical look at the location of Singapore and explained a little bit about its role in global trade, maybe what we can do next, RP, is to zoom into the spectrum of Chinese groups found within Singapore. So RP, you would identify as being Hokkien. Would that be your dialect group?
Oh, yes. I am Hokkien, true and true. And you are Teochews.
RP's Hokkien, I am Teochews, and amongst the rest of the Chinese in Singapore, you also find the Cantonese. That's my mom. My mom's Cantonese. My wife is Hainanese. And then you have the Hakka. The groups I'm not so familiar with would be the Henghua, the Hokkien, and the Straits Chinese, the Peranakans. Am I missing out on any groups, RP?
I think there is a very small population of Shanghainese here as well. From the origin, that means not the new immigrants, but from the original immigrants, I believe there's a small population of Shanghainese. What else is there? You covered the Henghua, the Hokkien. Yeah, I guess you covered most of the ones that we could name.
Because Hokkiens and Teochews, we share a common ancestry, would that be correct? Or language ancestry, Mingnan?
Geographically, we are neighbors, so we have a very common development from way back then. And remember one of our last conversations, I couldn't remember the saying we have about the Hokkiens and Teochews when we were talking about, even though we are neighbors, we still have our stereotypes and our differences and our conflicts with each other. So yeah, I finally remember that saying. The saying goes, Teochew hao lian, Hokkien lao bian.
Could you translate that for us?
To translate, you roughly translate to the Teochews are arrogant and the Hokkiens are liars. So it's kind of like a stereotype of how we see each other, how our ancestors see each other when they were all back in the old homelands. The Teochews will look at the Hokkiens and say, you are cheats and liars. And the Hokkiens will look at the Teochews and go like, oh, you are arrogant buffoons, And both
That's interesting.
Yeah, and both of our clans, both of our people would have this common problem with the Hokkien people who were basically another neighbor of ours. And I don't think I should say what we say about the Hokkien here, being such a public forum, let's just say that it's not so nice.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective, and collectively combined, the Hokkiens and the Teochews make up the majority of the Chinese living in Singapore today. If my numbers are correct, as of 1990, there were 896,000 Hokkiens in Singapore. And 2020, that number has actually gone up to about 1.18 million. The Teochews would be the second largest group, hailing from Guangdong, with 466,000 in 1990 and increasing to 583,000 in 2020. So Hokkien's first, the largest group. Teochews come next, followed by the Cantonese, the Hakka, the Hainanese, the Hokkien, the Henghua, and you mentioned earlier the Shanghainese.
Very little of them. Very little of them.
Individuals hailing from Shanghai, Jiangsu, Zhejiang. The numbers were 17,000 in 1990 and approximately 22,000 in 2020. Pretty significant numbers. Yeah.
Okay.
So actually grown by approximately 5,000 over the 30-year period. 22,000.
I would have guessed there were more Cantonese in Singapore. I did not realize that they.
Cantonese.
No. I mean
Cantonese would be.
No, I mean when you say that Cantonese are third largest group in Singapore,
Yeah.
I always thought that there were more Cantonese than Teochews in Singapore. I did not expect the Teochew to be the second largest group. I guess most probably because we don't hear people speaking Teochew that much in Singapore, I guess.
I fear it's been lost. I can't speak it. My brother can't speak it. I'm not going to be able to teach it to my son.
I mean, all the Abeng Kia will be speaking Hokkien lah, so that's not an issue. It's almost like a lingua franca already against amongst the blue collar workers, to put it in another way. And I guess a lot of people speak Cantonese because of TV series and drama and stuff like that. And maybe that's why I get this misconception that there should be more Cantonese in Singapore, because seriously I don't hear anyone speaking Teochew since I grew up, to be very honest. My auntie married a Teochew guy, so that's my only access to the Teochew language since I grew up. When I was younger, my sifu in the martial arts school was an old Teochew, speaks with a heavy Swatao accent. Couldn't understand 80% of what he said. But after that, I don't think I've met anyone that spoke Teochew to me. Yeah. Maybe some old cab drivers, maybe. But among the
That's interesting. So your sifu was from Swatao?
No. He was local. But the older generation.
Ancestry linking back.
Yeah, but he spoke with that. When we say an old Teochew man that spoke with a very heavy accent, we'll always say, the old Swatao accent.
The mental connection is going.
Yeah, Swatao. It must be a Swatao accent, Like Cantonese, certain Cantonese, if you hear them speak, you immediately know that they are from Fatsan, the Fatsan area. And
you can? So you can detect the
accents, the accents.
Wow, okay.
Like the Fatsan Cantonese, when they say eating.
Fatsan is Foshan?
Foshan, Foshan.
Yeah.
So Lingnan area, Foshan area, when they say eating, eating in Cantonese, a lot of us will say sik fan. But with the Fatsan,
that's what I'm used to.
Hack fan.
What?
Hack fan.
Okay, that's new. Hack fan.
So that's their own geographical variation on the. I mean, even Hokkien, you listen to a Taiwanese speak Hokkien, and you listen to anyone else speak Hokkien.
You got Fujian Hokkiens, you got Taiwanese Hokkiens.
Actually, it's called the Zhangzhou variation and the Quanzhou variation. Yeah, Zhangzhou is a bit further north, if I'm not wrong. So most of the Taiwanese residents would be originally from the Zhangzhou region. They moved across the strait. Whereas those that came to the south, to Southeast Asia, most of the Hokkien people, and another reason why there's such a high Hokkien population in Southeast Asia, not just in Singapore, in Southeast Asia as a whole, because the port that they got on board the ship to come south was actually in Ameng, Xiamen, Quemoy. The old name will be Quemoy, if I'm not wrong. The new Romanized name will be Xiamen. So Xiamen was the port of embarkation for all these Chinese immigrants that came to Southeast Asia, and that's why a lot of the locals, to escape their own life, back in the old country, would take the ship and come to Singapore. And because the port was in Xiamen, which is in Fujian, so there's a lot of the local population who move. And being neighbors with Guangdong, which houses most of the Cantonese and the Teochews and the Hakkas.
Teochews and Guangdong as well.
Yeah, and so that's the next next biggest portion of immigrants that came from there. So yeah, sorry for tangenting off.
Well, I think it's important to kind of like link back to the geographical roots. So the Hokkiens would come from Xiamen.
Yeah.
That would be one of the places. There's
Xiamen,
Quanzhou.
yeah.
There's Zhangzhou, as you mentioned. There's Zhaoan. There's Kinmen. Right? And then the Teochews, who will be coming in from Guangdong province. So what's interesting is that Fujian Hokkiens, you have your own province.
Yeah, Fujian.
And then for the Teochew, we are not provincial level. We exist in the province of Guangdong, and we hail from places like Chaozhou, Swatao, or Shantou, as you mentioned earlier, Chaoan, Chaoyang, Jieyang, and more. And the Cantonese are coming from Guangzhou, Foshan, Shunde, and Xinhui. You also have the Hakkas, the Hainanese, the Hokkien, the Henghuas, the Shanghainese, the Hokjia. And what's interesting is from my research, there are approximately 244,000 Chinese in Singapore today that's not identified as one of those subgroups. And
that's surprising.
I'll be
That's surprising.
because the number in 1990 was 50,000. So Chinese not belonging to these I guess classical Singapore subgroups, and that number ballooned to 244,000 as of 2020.
Well, from 1990 to 2020, 30 years, that number
has
quadrupled.
gone up approximately 5x, 4 to 5x.
Are they that productive?
It'll be interesting to go and find out where those ancestries come from.
But okay, 40 years, 30, 40 years, that's considered one generation. So 50,000 people, one generation quadrupled in number. It can be also. How many kids are they having each?
How did that happen? How did that
happen? Or some people just decided that, nah, I'm not a Hokkien anymore. I'm not a Teochew anymore. I'm just Chinese.
Yeah. So earlier we spoke about language relating to the dialect groups. I think what might be an interesting look also would be cuisine, food. I'm a big fan of Teochew food. Things like the braised duck, lo'ak. That's something is that getting a reaction from you? Bak chor mee. Would that be Teochew, bak chor mee? I'm not sure.
Bak chor mee, depending. There's a Hokkien version, there's the Teochew version, but the ones that we were talking about at 85 Market, if I'm not wrong, Henki, if I'm not wrong, is a Teochew family. They make Teochew style bak chor mee. That means we just mince meat and meatballs and nothing else. And in soup, which is very different.
Yeah, from the standard dry one.
Yeah, because most people understand bak chor mee as a dry noodle version, but they make the soup one, and that's why they are so famous. And if I remember correctly, I do remember them speaking Teochew when I was, buying from them or visiting the market back then.
Do you know if they're still open?
They are still there. They're still there.
Okay.
Still there. Although
I'm gonna make a date to go visit.
Just don't expect too much. As with all things, the law of entropy has made its made its entrance. So, I mean, imagine this. I was eating at that store from the time the previous generation was making the noodles. Where the old man was making the noodles, I was eating there, and I already detected a slight, deviation from norms when the generation took over that is serving until today. Yeah, so I went through that transition. If you want good bak chor mee of that style, there are a few other stores, and it's all actually a branch out from this main family. So I can gossip.
Also, they have roots.
No, I can give you. I can spill the tea on this whole bak chor mee saga where you
enlighten me, man.
It's a whole story and a half. I tell you, it's like a family saga that spans through generations.
Like internal feud.
Yeah, you can read like it's like you're reading a novel or something. So, but anyways, that's besides the point. Besides what we're talking about on this channel. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. Feeling hungry.
Anyways, we are talking about cuisine, bak chor mee, law art. Yeah. Praise that.
Beyond that, sun gui, peng gui, these are all things I'm looking forward to. What's the term? Makan or to eat when I return in a few months'
You're going to
time.
be so sorely disappointed.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, man. When was the last time you were back here?
2019 or 2020. So it's been 2+ years.
Then you should know the standard of the peng gui and the sun gui are nowhere near what they're supposed to be. I mean, they are now all factory made.
I didn't try it the last time. Or is it factory made?
It's all factory made now, man. It's all factory made, and it lost that human touch, basically. Remember when we were kids, we would eat this. Would you consider them snacks? Gui. How would you describe gui to a listener or audience now?
Snack, I think.
Usually,
it's not something you have for a proper meal. It's something you have between meals.
Or for breakfast.
Yeah, it's completely possible to have it for breakfast, yes.
It's a lot of starch.
A lot of starch.
Not always
glutinous rice.
Glutinous rice. Not always pastry, but it can come in the form of pastry as well. How do you describe gui to someone who's never had it?
You have to see it and taste it.
And another trivial, the word gui itself, I don't think is Chinese to begin with. I think gui is a Malay term that we adopted in Singapore and in Southeast Asia, if I'm not wrong. So even that, you tell someone in China about gui, they might not even understand what you're talking about. Yeah. So there's
because our culture and language is intermingled.
Oh yes.
Street population, like the term pasar, which refers to market, is something that Chinese were like, this has no meaning to me.
And pasar came from the word pasat, which is Malay. Pasar. And I believe that term actually came from the Arabs when they were in Singapore in the very, very early colonial days, or even before, where they will come, the Arab traders will come to Southeast Asia to trade. And what do Middle Eastern traders do when they trade? They set up a bazaar. B-A-Z-A-A-R. Even the word bazaar.
So phonetically, the sounds.
Yeah, so the
really
word, the English word bazaar actually came from the Arab roots as well. So I wouldn't be so surprised if the word pasar, which later now become pasar in Singapore for market, would have come from the same etymological roots as what I was saying before. There are a lot of these cases, especially in Southeast Asia, where it's a smorgasbord of different cultures and traditions and languages, which would explain the very, very unique position Singapore finds itself in, and the Chinese population will find itself in this corner of the world, I guess.
Do you have any favorite Hokkien foods to recommend to me or to us, the readers and listeners?
To be very honest, when it comes to food, I'm the least Hokkien person you'll know.
That's fascinating. Can we dig a bit deeper into that?
I don't even know there's actually Hokkien food until I grew up. I was like, I don't know, man. I didn't know there was Hokkien food until I think I was in my late 20s or early 30s. Seriously.
Wow.
I knew there was Teochews food. I knew there was Cantonese food. I knew there was Sichuanese food, Shanghainese food.
So that was your norm growing up?
Yeah.
So Hokkien food wasn't a thing until
it was not a
later.
thing. I didn't even know we Hokkiens have a thing. You know?
Cuisine.
Like we know the Teochews, you guys have a lot of steamed food. You guys eat a lot
steamed
of
fish,
porridge, very light on the palate kind of stuff. The Cantonese, we know they love their soups, very good soup makers. They love their dried seafood and dried ingredients.
The dried scallops.
Yeah. So that's the Cantonese. Then we know the Sichuanese and the Chengdu people, they love their spicy food. Okay, that's not from my childhood, but we'll get to that later.
We'll get to that.
You know, I know these things, you know, like, different Chinese people have their own cuisines, but I never knew that the Hokkiens have our own cuisines until I was much older. Okay, now I remember one thing that I really like as a Hokkien, mee hoon kueh.
Mee hoon kueh.
Yeah, mee hoon kueh is Hokkien. And I never knew it was a Hokkien dish, although I ate it growing up when my grandma used to make it at home, in her home. I used to eat it, but I never knew what it was. I never knew that it was a Hokkien dish until much later. And anything else that I like to eat that's Hokkien? Can't really remember. Even braised duck.
So mee hoon kueh is a soupy dish.
It's a soup.
Soup and noodles.
Basically, it's just dough and soup.
Yeah.
Basically, you tear the dough.
And the noodle is unusual, right? It's not like the thin.
Yeah, it's dough.
nicely
Basically, it's
shaped
just
ones.
dough. It's hand pull dough. So you make that big ball of
Hand
dough, and
pull
then
dough.
you pull that dough out. You flatten it, and then you break it up and throw it into a soup with some minced pork and an egg, and ikan bilis lah.
Ikan bilis.
Fried anchovies for
Fried anchovies.
for our listeners. So another bak kut teh. Bak kut teh.
Bak kut teh?
Is it Hokkien or Teochews bak kut teh?
Yeah, that's an interesting one to discuss.
Okay, we already have a
because there will be claims from the Teochews side.
We already
that
have a battle between Singapore and Malaysia over bak kut teh. Let's not start another war between the Hokkiens and the
cultural
Teochews.
division.
Let's not start another one. We already have enough problem as it is.
Because in Malaysia you have the more herbal bak kut tehs.
Yeah, that's the herbal one.
And then in Singapore we have it with more peppery.
The pepper.
So,
usually we call it the black soup or the white soup, or black base or white base. So the black one, of course, is the herbal one, and then we have the peppery base, which is the white base. So yeah, that's about it. Even braised duck, I prefer the Teochews braised duck. I only eat braised duck from one store.
Which one would that be?
And I've been eating there since I was 11 years old. I'm 42 now, so 33 years.
Well, that's 3 decades, man. 30 rotations around the sun. You'll be eating at the same one.
At this.
You have to bring me there next time.
Yeah, the Bedok Central Market. There's one store there, run by this Teochews family. They started that store. Their father started the store back in the 70s in Joo Chiat, and then they got relocated and they moved to the Bedok Central Market. And they've been there ever since. I don't know if they're still around. Hopefully they're still around. I haven't been back there in years. So food. That's what I eat. And my latest thing is what? Mala thing. The mala thing I've been eating for years. But
yeah, let's talk about the mala thing for a bit, because mala wasn't really a thing when we were growing up in our teens. It wasn't that popular, but in my last few visits back home, I'm beginning to see it everywhere. How often would you have mala? Is that a regular part of your diet nowadays?
Depending. Originally, okay, let's set the record straight first. Mala was not even a thing when we were teenagers. Like, it did not exist in Singapore. First wave of mala that came into Singapore, if I'm not wrong, was in the 2000s already.
2000s.
And back then it was mala hot pot. You could only go to the restaurant and you order the hot pot, like how we eat hot pot, and then we eat the mala hot pot in the restaurant.
So it's a soup base and you put food in.
And then you cook your own ingredients. And a meal will cost you, usually it's like buffet style, cost you like 20 to 40 bucks for a meal. So that was a first time a mala hot pot came to Singapore. And that one, obviously, we know is a very Sichuan dish. And it exists in Sichuan. And then this...
So it's quite different from the southern Chinese food that we will grow up with.
Of course.
Sichuan is all the way through to the west, near the west of China.
Yeah, it's spice heavy, is heavier on the taste, and is definitely...
peppercorns, so numbing.
Peppercorns, of course. And there's a reason why they use those peppercorns, because back in the days, in the Sichuan area, if I'm not wrong, they couldn't get salt and they couldn't get any form of seasoning. And the only thing that could add any kind of like taste to the food they eat was this kind of seed or fruit that grew on bushes in the mountains. And so these people went to gather them up and dry them, and they use it. Oh yeah, it gives this very tingly sensation when you put it in your mouth. And that was a Sichuan peppercorn. And they did not have chili back then. Chili came much later into China. So yeah, peppercorn. Sorry, another tangent. But yeah, so that was a hot pot. So I was in love with the hot pot from like day one, man. Like once I first tried it, it became a weekly thing for me. I would save up all my money.
A weekly thing.
Yeah, I would save up
Wow.
all my money and go for one mala hot pot meal per week back then. And then, of course, more recently, the last, I guess it's the last 10 or maybe less than 10 years, we start to have this mala xiang guo thing popping up all over Singapore in all the hawker centers and coffee shops. And this was when mala became really a trend in Singapore. It's basically just been a decade. And this mala pot thing, this new mala xiang guo, fragrant pot or whatever.
It's a dry version of it.
It's fried.
Would that be?
Yeah,
it's fried.
Okay. Yeah, it's fried in spices and also dry. And of course, you can order it in a soup version as well, which will basically be like you're eating a mala hot pot, but it's all pre-prepared and you just eat it out of the bowl. So this is a more recent thing, less than a decade, if I'm not wrong, or a decade. And another trivia: this mala dish did not originate from Sichuan to begin with. Rumors has it that this dish actually originated somewhere in Beijing, and it was like this chef, or this, I think it's a chef from Sichuan, who tried to make a living in Beijing. And I think there's this Chinese term some of you might know called 北漂, which means, migrants from all over China that would move to Beijing to make a living for themselves. Because let's face it, it's a tier 1 city, pay is better there as compared to the rest of the country, most of the rest of the country. So a lot of local immigrants would travel to Beijing. And so this Sichuan chef went to Beijing, and it was there because, as you know, food is kind of like a DNA for us. There's a genetic memory, and so a lot of these Sichuanese who live in Beijing and work there, they miss the food of their homeland. They miss the heavy spices. They miss the spiciness. They miss the oiliness. If you're in the north, like you say, you went to a Beijing style hot pot place, the soup base is like water.
Water, yes, I remember. Yeah, so I was very surprised.
Very bland. So the Sichuanese will want their own, they like their heavy stuff, man. So he came out and he was like, I can't open up a hot pot shop here. How many people will come or whatever, for whatever reason. So why not make it more convenient for everyone? So he just threw everything into a wok, threw some spices in, threw in the spice paste, fried it up, and was like, here's a dish. And it's mala xiang guo. And because it's portable, it's scalable, and it's transferable. Yeah, it's portable, transferable, and scalable.
Yeah, easily spreadable.
Yeah. Easily spreadable with, sounds familiar. I think we used these terms before somewhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, it started taking over first China, and then with the second wave of the Chinese migrants into Singapore, it also came into Singapore with a few other of their local dishes that has now become quite synonymous with a Singaporean diet today. Like, who would imagine eating something like mala 20, 30 years ago? We wouldn't even know what it is, but now we are all eating it like our lives depends on it. So, yeah.
And it's extremely popular in Australia as well. Even here in Melbourne,
yes,
you have mala restaurants. Mala xiang guo is not yet a thing, but we have something similar.
The hot pot style. You have the hot pot restaurants there.
Yeah, but not the xiang guo approach. I think that maybe... Does that exist in Sichuan itself, the mala xiang guo?
No.
A new emergence.
To them, it's still something new.
Singapore.
No, to the Sichuanese, it will be something new that spread down from Beijing side, like reconquering Sichuan. Yeah, like the origins were there, but it was not created there. Technically, it's a Beijing dish more than a Sichuan dish, basically. But all the ingredients and the methods and everything are Sichuanese. So, yeah. But anyways, if we are talking about development of the Chinese culture and traditions and everything, food, we can actually, just food itself, we can do an entire series on it, seriously. Because of all the cultural exchanges
exchanges, yeah.
through the ingredients and through the methods of cooking and everything. Even internally within the Chinese communities, I have to emphasize that. There's a lot of changes and a lot of development that goes on all the time, and it's never ending. Like when we talk about this mala thing, and this just happened within the last 10-15 years, and so we can safely say that Chinese culture is still evolving today.
Evolving. It's still dynamic.
It's still dynamic. It's still full of life. In fact, I would venture to say that the Chinese people and the Chinese culture is actually more full of life within the last 10-15 years, more lively than compared to the previous 100 years. Have you, where in your memory have you seen the Chinese people and the culture of the Chinese people being so full of life and so lively as today? Have you ever seen it like this before?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of cross-pollination between the Chinese groups, for sure. Maybe we could move over to looking at the concentration of these dialect groups in Singapore. I'm Teochews, and from my memory, there seems to be a large concentration of Teochews who grew up in the Hougang area.
Oh yeah,
which is,
where we have the most famous statue in Singapore.
So a bit of a fun fact. So in a previous life, when I first knew RP, I was playing in a band, and all 4 members of the band were, I don't know if it was through some kind of divine intervention. We were all from Chaozhou, with Chaozhou roots.
Oh, yeah.
The lead singer, of course, Wesley, whom we're both familiar with.
Very familiar.
He's Teochews. He's Teochews, and yeah, he's the quintessential Teochews because he was literally brought up in Hougang, and for a bit of a...
You know, I always thought he was Peranakan.
He was Peranakan?
I always thought he was Peranakan.
I'll be surprised. Oh, there'll be an interesting conversation to have with Wes.
Yeah, because I think I always thought their entire family was Peranakan until
I see.
Until I was not proven wrong. I was corrected.
Maybe it's Peranakan Teochews?
No.
Has the family
We
been here for a while?
I had this conversation with his cousin that we both know, and yeah, they are Teochews. And then once that switch got turned on, and then I look at them, I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely very Teochews.
Could you maybe unpack that a bit more? What does that mean? Like
the way they eat, the things they eat, the diet, their dietary habits, and some of their personality and characteristics. They carry some of the way they think, and especially when I met their parents' generation. I mean, I know their parents as well, family friend and all. So when you speak to their fathers, you could really feel a very Teochew vibe from the way they... You've met them before, right? You met the uncles before. You know, the way they sit, the way they talk, the way they express their views. To me, that is so quintessential Teochew style, like very man kind of thing, like really assertive people and habits and gestures. So yeah, when I was corrected and that switch got turned in my mind, I said, oh no, we are Teochew, we are not Peranakan.
Started to fall into place.
And then everything just fall into, oh yeah, that makes sense. That is so Teochew, you know, like, you know, their dietary habits are pretty similar to you. If you met the cousin, you know that he loved steamed fish as much as you.
Fish is a big part of the diet.
Yeah, and you know, uncle will always go fishing and he'll bring back all the fish and we'll be eating fishes.
Many stories of them going fishing. Yes.
But anyways, that was another sidetrack. So yeah, the concentration of the whole band, I did not know the rest of them were Teochews as well.
Yeah, the guitarist, Teochew, the rhythm guitarist Teochew, bassist Teochew, drummer Teochew, keyboardist Teochew as well.
I didn't know
Don't
you
know if
even
it
have
was,
a keyboardist.
Yeah, we later on, I think about 4 or 5 years later, we added on a keyboardist, and we asked him what dialect group you are. And Teochews like, is there some divine connection bringing us together?
You should rename your band, man.
Yeah, man.
The Teochews boys. Fly the flag.
So you find a lot of Teochews in the Hougang area, which is in the kind of like the north. Is it
Northeast?
Hougang would be the northeast area.
Northeast.
Would there be a similar type of concentration for the Hokkiens in terms of where you live in Singapore?
We are everywhere, man. We're everywhere.
You are the biggest group. More than 1 million.
Yeah. Which, if you look at the entire Singapore population, we make up like what, 20% around there.
Yep.
Of 6 million. Of 6 million, no. 1/6.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
just under 6 million. So it's very close to 20%.
Yeah. I know the Teochews are a lot in Hougang, the Cantonese are a lot in Chinatown. I know there's a small concentration of Hainanese somewhere also, but I just can't remember where. Yeah. But if you are saying that if we have like more concentration in certain areas, then these are the only 3 groups that I can think of, and only 2 groups I know exactly where they are. But in Singapore, I don't think that's so big of a segregation now. I mean, like you say, there are like what, 200,000 who does not even identify with any dialect group. They only identify with Chinese. And then, of course, you do know that there's another movement going on in Singapore for quite a while now to actually do away with the entire racial differentiation.
The CMIO.
Yeah, the CIMO. CMIO, Chinese, Malay, Indian, others. So there's also this movement to do away with that and consider all of us just Singaporeans, no race.
So no more labels.
Yeah. That's another story and a half. But the point is, I guess that is another evolution of, I think it ties in with your study, the unique evolution of the Chinese diaspora in Singapore specifically. Because in a way, you could say that for the past 40 years, there's been a consistent effort of de-Sinicizing of ourselves. I don't know. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but that's one way of looking at it. That not only to the Chinese population that we're getting de-Sinicized, but I guess the whole idea was to slowly integrate all our different races into a single people, which I'm not against. I'm totally fine with that. In fact, I identify as Singaporean, but the thing is, there are nuances as with everything in life, and doing away with the whole thing is, I don't think it would be a very wise move. It would literally cut off the roots of the people, be it you're Chinese, you're Malay, you're Indian, or you're others, or whatever. You take away this CMIO thing.
Like pressing the reset button altogether.
Yeah, like, where are our roots? Where are our roots? That was something, that was one of the main motivations behind the Cultural Revolution of China, to press a hard reset, and cut off any ties or any roots that ties the Chinese people to their past. And that's why they had the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or at least that is the official on paper reason. Let's not go into the whole political infighting and Mao trying to reclaim his position, or that side of the story. But the on paper story is that, we are going to hard reset and we are cut off the roots of everyone. We are going to cut off the links to the past of everyone. And we all could see what happened after the Cultural Revolution. And so, do we really want something like that happening here? Although we are not doing a hard reset, we are like slowly, gradually doing it. But would it be a good move for a people to not remember their roots? That is something I feel that there's still a lot of room for discussions.
Yeah, because we're beginning to see a change in the composition of Chinese in Singapore. The initial waves of immigration were from southern China during the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. And as of the 1990s and the early 21st century, we're beginning to see Singapore experiencing a third wave of immigration from different parts of China. Like, for instance, the change and shift in food culture. Mala was never a thing while growing up.
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, like I said, this whole mala thing was never, it did not even exist, and the whole xiangguo thing only appeared, in the last decade or decade and a half. And I guess this all, like you said, the different waves of Chinese immigrants that we are receiving in Singapore. I mean, the 1800s to the early 1900s or mid 1900s were the original Chinese immigrants who came here from the southern parts of China to escape poverty, to escape
for push reasons. They were pushed out.
Push reasons, or a lot of them could even have been tricked into coming to Nanyang, as this region was called back then, to be indentured labor, so to speak. And those were the originals from the 1800s and the 1900s. And the poor and the destitute will come to Nanyang, to the south, to Southeast Asia, whereas the rich and the educated at that time to escape. For context, anyways, late 1800s China is very, very, very bad. I think we spoke about this in one of the previous episodes. All the conflicts, the Sino-Japanese War, the Opium Wars, the invasion of the Western powers, blah, blah, blah. It all happened during that few decades, and a lot of people were escaping. So the rich would either go to Europe. A substantial group of students actually went to study in Europe in the late Qing dynasty, and they actually went back to China. But a big portion of this group that was sent out by the Qing government to study from the West, a portion of these students never returned to China. They stayed in Europe. Another group of them went to Japan, because Japan was a more advanced Asian country at that time. They had adopted mainly Western systems already after the Meiji Restoration. So a portion went to Japan, and a lot of the revolutionaries, the educated class, the scholars, and those people with the new ideas who want a republic instead of imperial China, they will be in Japan, and they will be in Taiwan. And only left the poor and the destitute who were trying to escape from this very, very harsh life. Only these people would come to Southeast Asia, because let's face it, Southeast Asia was really, really backward compared to the rest of the world back in the day. So yeah, that was an original wave of migrants, Chinese migrants, that we received in Singapore. And then in the 90s, we had another wave. And I personally would tend to separate the wave from the 90s and the wave after 2000 into two separate waves. The 90s wave came also for similar reasons. Is they wanted a better life for their next generation, their children, not necessarily for themselves. So in the 90s, we see a lot of mainland Chinese students come into Singapore, and maybe their mother would come with them, forming a single family unit, one mother and one or two child. The pei tu mama period, that was the 90s. And that was at a time where China was developing, but the wealth distribution, resource distribution was extremely unequal. So the rich were getting very rich, whereas the bottom half of society was still not moving fast enough. And a lot of this middle class, Chinese middle class of that time, felt that they could make a better living or better life for their children outside of China itself at that time. So one of the very popular destinations was Singapore or Australia and Canada back in the days. But Singapore was chosen by a lot of these families because we are a Chinese dominant population, and we speak the language, and culturally we are similar. I won't say same, we are similar, but there are a lot of differences that will cause a lot of social problems, like maybe we will touch on either later or in the next episode. So that's the second wave. Third wave is 2000s, beyond the 2000s already. Like you said, 2008 was when China really got really powerful and they, tell the
officially
world,
announced the rise to the world.
we are
Beijing
here,
Olympics.
the dragon has awakened,
Yeah.
And then that was another wave of Chinese immigration coming into Singapore during that period until today. But you can see that the numbers are lower and lower already because the push factor is not that high anymore. A lot of this latest wave of immigration, they either want a different life experience and they are using Singapore as maybe for some of them would be as a stepping board to go further out into the world. Singapore, I mean, for any Westerner trying to come east, Singapore is a good place for them because it's like Asia light. For any Easterner, any Chinese specifically who wants to go west to an English-speaking world, Singapore is like the beginner village if you play an RPG game. Go in there, you do all the tutorials, you learn all the necessary language or skills and systems that other people use in the West. You use this as like a stepping stone. So a lot of them use it as that. So there's a very different push and pull factor and very different motivations for these three waves of immigrants. And to go back a bit, to backtrack a bit to when I was talking about the people, and we were talking about the composition of the people, of the population, Chinese population. The original migrants, we spoke about it last time, 1800s, 1900s, because the port was in Fujian, in Quanzhou, in Xiamen. So Quanzhou, the southerners were all here and all the poor and destitute came here. So that was the first wave. And then the 90s wave, you would realize it also coincides with the period of time when Mala was a thing in Singapore. Because that wave, I noticed, I was in my late teens and early 20s already, right? We were in our late teens and early 20s.
Late teens.
Yeah, the 90s and early 2000s to mid 2000s, I consider this one wave. I noticed there's a lot of Sichuanese people from Chengdu, from Sichuan, Yunnan areas in Singapore. Most of the Chinese mainlanders I know during that time were either from Chengdu or Sichuan. And that also coincided with when Mala became a thing, the Mala hot pot version. And like I said, the past 10, 15 years was when this whole Mala Xiang Guo thing took off. And this is practically a northern dish. And now you start seeing in this latest wave, the post-2005, 2008 wave, you start to see a lot more northerners coming into Singapore already. I start to get to know a lot more people from Hubei, Hebei, even Beijing. I don't think I know anyone from Beijing. But interesting fact, I actually took a cab a couple of months back, and the cab driver was actually from Tianjin, China. Naturalized Singaporean lady. And we had a great time, talking about xiangsheng and all the cultural and traditional arts and stuff that is very popular in Tianjin. So yeah, you start, but she's definitely one of those, we spoke, and she's one of those that came as a Peitu Mama in the 90s, but naturalized. But the point I'm trying to make is that original, we have the Southerners, 90s to early 2000s, we have the Westerners, Sichuan, Chengdu region, more towards the west and southwest of China. And then the post 2005, 2010 wave, we start to see the mainlanders from practically all over China. Most of China will come in. And in fact, there are a lot more northerners that's coming out of China in the past 5-10 years. Even if you go on YouTube, there are quite a few of these channels that are run by northern Chinese men, northern Chinese people that left China, maybe living in Singapore, living in Japan, living somewhere, and you realize that, there's quite a lot of northerners that's actually coming out of China nowadays. And since we are talking about composition, and before that, I was talking about, in a way, we are cutting off our roots over the past decades. This immigration, although they cause a lot of social backlash in a way, I guess it's also a good thing to a certain extent, like nuances people. I don't believe I heard so many drunk uncles in a coffee shop speaking Mandarin 10 years ago, you know. But now you go to a coffee shop,
You
it's
probably
like
have heard dialects more back in the day.
everyone will be speaking Hokkien or Cantonese, you
Mhm.
know, or some Teochews if you can find it. But Hokkien and Cantonese mainly in any coffee shop. You know, let's put it this way, for it is what it is. Coffee shops is a blue collar heaven for blue collar workers in Singapore. We have our food there, we meet our friends there, we have our drinks there. You know, it's kind of like it's a very social place. And 10 years ago, you don't hear people speaking Mandarin there, the older generation. Our generation, yes, we'll be speaking Mandarin or English, but the older generation, half a generation older than us even, they will be speaking dialect. I don't think I've heard so much Mandarin being spoken in Singapore growing up. Today in 2022, I hear more Mandarin being spoken in public outside than when I was a kid. And I guess that is in a way the effect of having this huge influx of Chinese immigrants into the country. So yeah, that is something that's worth considering and thinking, you know, the food
extremely
changes.
dynamic. Yeah.
And like what you were saying in one of our conversations is, or was it just now that you mentioned this, that it's not just what we consume, you know, into our stomach, but it's also what we consume into our mind
Into our heads and our minds.
and our souls, basically. Yeah.
So there was an article that I was reading recently, published in the International Communication of Chinese Culture. It's entitled "The Divisiveness of Chinese Identities in Singapore." So the article's abstract reads: in July 2019, the Jamestown Foundation, an American think tank, published a report accusing China of imposing a Chinese identity onto Singapore through propaganda and influence operations. So in response, this article by Ashton Ng argues that the report was factually inaccurate and is itself an influence operation aimed at engendering distrust towards China. The rediscovery of a Chinese cultural identity by some Chinese Singaporeans, from Lee Kuan Yew to Nathan Hartono, is fueled not by China's clandestine influence operations, but by an intrinsic desire to mend ruptures in one's cultural heritage. So I think I can relate with this. Historically, the Chinese in Singapore have discarded or readopted their Chinese cultural identities, depending on the degree to which contact is kept with China. When contact with China diminishes, successful generations of Singapore Chinese inevitably cease to identify China as a cultural motherland. And when contact with China resumes, the Chinese in Singapore have frequently become divided, split into those who culturally identify as Chinese and those who do not. Since the 1978 reform and opening up of China, the restoration of contact between China and Singapore have led to a rekindling of interest amongst Chinese Singaporeans in their cultural identities. This rekindling yields three major consequences. First of which, Chinese Singaporeans may become further divided in terms of their cultural identity, with desynicized, monolingual English speakers on one extreme. I can identify with that part of the spectrum for most of my life. And I think this is probably where I am today, a re-Sinicized cultural Chinese on the other. Secondly, successful generations of re-Sinicized Singaporeans may grow up imbibing and consuming China's cultural exports, thereby becoming less distinct from their mainland counterparts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, especially relating to the consumption of China's cultural exports.
I thought this would be more in your wheelhouse when it comes to media. Anyways, this is my personal observations when we talk about Chinese media exports. Now they talk about Chinese media export as in like the media that's exported from mainland China itself. Whereas for me, personally, what I'm going to talk about, what I'm trying to say now is that Chinese media export to all of us outside of the whole Greater China zone has never ceased and has never been gone. You know, it has always been present. It has been always been present in every single Chinese community around the world. Why do I say that? Because in the 70s and the 80s and up until the 90s, we all grew up watching TVV productions. We all grew up watching Hong Kong movies. And this is Chinese. This is Chinese. It might be in Cantonese as a language, but it's a very distinctively Chinese cultural media that's exported to the rest of the world, the Chinese community around the world. I mean, we have the triad movies, the cops,
the Guazai movies,
the Guazai movies, Young and Dangerous. We have the triad movies. Even before Guazai, that was in the 90s, but earlier triad movies, the Chow Yun Fat stuff, Sui Hak, and all these famous directors. I mean, heck, even Quentin Tarantino loved those shows. So you can't say there hasn't been any Chinese media export, because even back then, Shaw Brothers, Golden Harvest, from the 60s, 70s, it's always been there. And to the mid-90s and 2000s, I noticed a change in the Mandarin media consumption habits of Singaporeans, or in fact, I believe is true also for most of the Chinese-speaking world, of the Chinese diaspora, that from the 90s to 2000s, we have this switch from from Hong Kong productions. We start consuming more Taiwanese dramas, variety shows, and some of their travelogues and stuff like that. And Taiwanese media was very popular from the late 90s to through the 2000s, basically. And now we come to the third wave, which is media exports directly from China itself, produced, either by one of their satellite stations or one of their CCTV main TV stations. And let's face it, they are really fantastic. The production values, the talents they have at their fingertips, to utilize. A lot of these productions are really, really fantastic. Like, I might actually be able to see one of my dreams come true, like film something like the Three Kingdoms or something about the Warring Stage, with full Chinese cast and crew, but Western production
values
and
scale.
And scale is definitely not a problem. I believe Chinese production can outdo the scale of any Western production, just simply by the fact that they have a bigger population and a bigger landmass to begin with. So scale is not, but production values and production integrity. Once the Chinese can achieve these two in their media production, I believe they could at least in the Chinese population, I mean global Chinese population, I think they can very easily catch up or even overtake some Hollywood productions. We're not talking about AAA productions or whatever, that is still things. But you get where I'm going with this. So 3 distinct phases of Chinese media imports through the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years. Never stopped. It's always been there. Only difference is from different sources. First, you have the Hong Kong source, so they are telling stories. Let me slip into my storyteller and writer mode for a while. So the difference is in the stories and the angle that they are coming from, these productions are coming from. So in the early 80s and 90s, we are telling the story, the Chinese story, from the POV of a colonized people, the Hong Kongers. They are colonized people and they are telling the story of their people through that lens of a colony. And we could see, very distinct, story plot points that can only be produced by people that live under their conditions, like stories of like being oppressed by their colonizers, by being bullied and all that stuff. It only happens there. And, it's always the story of the underdog. Yes, the underdog trope is everywhere, in every single story. But you get what I'm trying to say. It's always the story of the underdog in the 70s or 80s media production that we get from Hong Kong. And then from the 90s to 2000s, then we have Taiwan. And this is once again another angle and another story of a similar people. From a macro view, we are all the same people. We are all Chinese to most people. But the message and the stories they tell are different. The Taiwanese point of view, what is the Taiwanese point of view? What is the Taiwanese POV? They are back then, and I still believe in the original Taiwanese mindset. For some disclosure, my maternal side of the family is actually from Jingmen Zanqu. So we actually fought the PRC back in the days where the KMT retreated to Taiwan. And so the story the Taiwanese media were telling in the 90s and 2000s, it was a very optimistic story. But at the same time, it was the story of a people that has a wish and a desire to go home. The Taiwanese POV, the Taiwanese story is the story of a people trying to go home and they can't. So that is that POV from the 90s to 2000 that we see from Taiwanese production. And then the latest wave, the powerhouse, the media powerhouse in Asia now is indisputably China. And I think we discussed this before. I love their production value, and I love a lot of the talents that is coming out from mainland China media nowadays. But they still have a long way to go in terms of storytelling and production integrity and stuff like that. But the thing is, now we are having another POV or another the story of these people again, but another angle, another POV. And what is the message and what is the story that they are telling? They are trying to tell the story of a long oppressed people that's finally found their footing and they are embarking on their adventure in a bigger stage, I guess. And these are the three very distinct phases of media export, Chinese media export, that I observed in my own capacity as a media consumer. And this really screws a lot of people's minds up. Yeah.
Because from the macro, it looks like the same narrative, but it's really from different agendas and different perspectives.
And a lot of
from
times,
Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland. And
a lot of times, these angles and agendas and these POVs actually comes into conflict with each other. So, and over time, with the passage of time and the evolution of society and social norms, is actually very different now. If you ask someone from 70s Hong Kong to look at today's Hong Kong, or you ask someone from 90s Taiwan to look at today's Taiwan, and maybe they would not even recognize the stories that they are telling now. But the thing is, what's more important is that would any Chinese mainlander back in 1990 ever imagine that they would be the media powerhouse in Asia today? I don't think many of them would have even dared to imagine that, and how fast and how far they have come. But I believe that the Chinese people on the mainland have a similar problem with Singaporeans as a whole, not just Singaporean Chinese. We have a very similar problem. I always said this to anyone who will listen, and I'm going to offend a lot of viewers now again. Once again, with Api's hot takes. We this is a phrase I always use. We have first world infrastructure, but we have third world people. Let's face it, it's a fact. Our mindset, our software, our mindset, our mentality, our maturity, still haven't caught up to the physical advances that we have built. And that is a problem we faced, and we are, figuring out our way and walking out of it, one day, one step at a time. And this is a problem that the mainland Chinese are facing today as well. And it's even more, it's better now. I mean, why do everyone in the world, the initial anti-Chinese wave back in the 90s and early 2000s, I don't know if you remember that, there was an anti-Chinese wave back then when the nouveau riche from mainland China started traveling around the world, and they started acting very ungraciously, and which drew the ire and irritation of many, many people around the world. And that was a problem of when you have too much physical resources. You have control a lot of physical resources, but your mindset, your maturity, and your soul have not caught up to this physical advancement yet. And that was a problem. And that was a problem for Singapore. That is a problem for Singapore. And that is a problem for mainland China as well. It takes time. No two ways about it. It takes time. And but we can see now, even though, like we're talking about a composition of the Chinese population in Singapore, yes, we do have more, a bigger number of mainland Chinese that came into Singapore the past few decades. But at the same time, I don't know if you've noticed from the previous time you were back here in 2019, that's 3 years ago, there's actually less tension and less conflict between the local Chinese and the mainland Chinese, the new immigrants or the Xin Yiming. There's less conflict between the third, fourth generation local Chinese and the Xin Yiming now as compared to 30 years ago. There's much less conflict. Number one, I guess, because the mainlanders have matured because in their own way, and they are more confident in what they are and who they are and what they are doing. On the other hand, I believe it's also because, like I said just now, I don't think I've heard so much Mandarin being spoken in a coffee shop in Singapore until now. And from there, we can, deduce that there is a deeper understanding between the old diaspora and the new diaspora, right? So I believe there's a deeper understanding, and we could see that by the effort that both sides are putting in. For one, the uncles are trying to speak Mandarin as well as they can. And for another, I also noticed that a lot of these these new immigrants are also trying to adapt to our way of doing things. And so at the same time, I guess it also reintroduced a bit of that rootedness back into the Chinese culture in Singapore itself. But at the same time, there's one thing I want to bring up also. Because of the cultural revolution that happened in mainland China, a lot of Chinese traditions were actually passed down outside of China. So our worship rituals, our temples, how we worship.
So the lineage managed to continue because
outside of mainland.
Export.
Yeah, because it's all been exported out. So a lot of it, a lot of times there were a few incidents. Actually, some of these new immigrants that I know, they come and then we started talking, and then we start talking about some of the traditions and everything, and they were so surprised, like, oh, that's how you do things. And they were like, oh, so that's how it's supposed to be done, or oh, so that's why this ritual is done this way. A lot of them don't remember them at all already. It's basically a lot of the culture and traditions were gone, basically annihilated.
It's a hard reboot.
It's a hard reboot.
Survived.
So is that what you want Singaporeans to be in future? That we can't even remember? Yes, we will all recognize ourselves and identify ourselves as Singaporeans. But the thing is, we do not have such a thick cultural and tradition foundation. We do not have such a thick history for us to rely upon. and to identify as a culture. What is Singapore culture? Is there any Singapore culture? I would argue that there is a seedling of Singapore culture. Is there. We could see it growing, but is it strong enough that we can actually de-Sinicize ourselves or de-Malay ourselves, de-Indian ourselves, and recognize as Singaporean? I think it's still too bloody early to say that. But this new composition of the Chinese population had its birthing pains, its teething problems back in the 90s, I feel, because it was a shock to the system, partly because of the numbers that were actually brought in at the time. It's ridiculous. But at the same time, over time now, having these decades to
found some space for harmony or finding a balance.
To figure out how we all work, to figure out how we all deal with things, the system that we work with. And over time, I believe we also start to realize that, hey, there are more similarities than differences between us.
Differences.
So, so that's
as you mentioned earlier, the Teochews and the Hokkiens didn't quite get along before.
Yeah.
But over time, here we are in a conversation.
Here we are. And I still wouldn't jam with your all Teochew band. Nah, just kidding. I'll take any chance to jam now, man. Being old and fat now, not the young hotshot vocalist back then. Yeah.
So if I can round off our conversation today with a look at Singapore and China ties. There's an article which I found in the South China Morning Post. It's entitled, "Even After 40 Years, China Can Still Learn from Singapore." This was published December 20th, 2018, and it comes with the following opening paragraph. So this week in December 2018 marks the 40th anniversary of the official start of China's reform and opening up, when the third plenary session of the Communist Party's 11th Central Committee was held from December 18th to 22nd, 1978. And just 1 month before the historic conference in November 1978, Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore, marveling over its achievements in development. During the trip, Singapore's founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew told Deng, "Whatever we have done, you can do better, because we are the descendants of the landless peasants of South China. You have the scholars, you have the scientists, you have the specialists. Whatever we do, you will do better." I'd like to pick your brains on how you feel about this quote.
I think I actually saw this video of Mr. Lee saying this, and in a way, he's not wrong. Like we mentioned earlier, our original Chinese immigrants were really the landless peasants from the south of China that was trying to escape poverty and harsh life, and so he was right. And the scholars, the scientists, the specialists were either in Europe, Japan, or Taiwan, or staying behind to help rebuild China from the ashes of the early 1900s. So not wrong, but one main reason why Mr. Lee said this, and remember this was 1978, although China of that time had their specialists and their scholars, they were not really very advanced. But one thing China did have and still have, and what Mr. Lee saw and what prompted him to say, you have the scholars, you have the scientists, was that China has a huge population. They have a huge talent pool to work with. And so you don't have scientists today, never mind. You can train a scientist. You don't have a scholar today, you can train a scholar. Out of 1,000, can you get one good one? You can't. Out of 10,000, can you get a good one? How about out of 14 billion? So they have that talent pool to work from, and they can have these people. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, also the rich and the educated and the literati, they don't come south. A lot of them either, like say, Europe, Taiwan, Japan, or stayed in the mainland. And a lot of their descendants are still there. But 1978, when Mr. Lee made this comment, I think he was being just a smidgen disingenuous lah. Because this was just a few years after the Cultural Revolution, where all the intellectuals and all the traditionalists or anyone with any form of knowledge or a skill or anything that would tie them to the past would have been, back then they call it what, pito. They would have been brought down, they would have been oppressed, they would have been thrown into labor camps and all these things. And 1978, this was just a few years after the whole Cultural Revolution. And China, if I'm not wrong, at that time was recovering and well on the road of recovery. But still, to say that they have the scholars and the scientists at that time would be a little bit disingenuous, you know.
It's got to read between the lines as well.
Yeah, but the thing is, they are the descendants of the scholars and the scientists and the specialists, while we are the descendants of really landless peasants and coolies, basically. So, yeah. I would kind of agree with this, and his foresight has been proven once again. Because end of the day, the soft stuff, the skills and the knowledge can be imparted, can be trained, but the character of a person, of a people, we always talk about character of a person, but we always avoid talking about character of a people. So you throw the Chinese people anywhere, they will make it. Because number one, the Chinese are pragmatic. Number two, Chinese are bloody tenacious. And if they really want to do something, they would do it. It doesn't matter, how big the price they have to pay. And so, yeah, today they do have the scholars, they have the scientists, and they have the specialists today.
Yep. So in the same article, in a later paragraph, Singapore's former Foreign Minister George Yeo once said of the bilateral relationship between Singapore and China, and he said, "I would describe Singapore as a bonsai or penzai, which is of occasional interest to China because of genetic similarities." I'm wondering if you agree that statement or not, that Singapore can be thought of as a miniature China or bonsai, which is of occasional interest to China because of the genetic similarities.
When did Mr. Yeo make this comment?
2010s lah. 2010s.
Well, that's very, very recent.
Yeah.
I thought that would be earlier, because I guess the reason why Mr. Yeo made that remark was, I don't know if you can recall, but there was a period of time where they set up this Confucian Institution or Confucian Academy in Singapore. I can't remember the exact name. And this would tie back into this article by Ashton that we read earlier, that was accusing China of imposing Chinese identity onto Singapore through propaganda and influence. And that was what many people felt the Confucian Institute was. And personally, this is my own take on it. I believe it is at least half true that that's what China was trying to do back then. They were still trying to figure out how to play this whole soft power influence game. The West has got like 100 years or at least 50 years head start, ahead of the Chinese people. So they were trying to figure it out. And of course, they made some blunders along the way. And until today, like I mentioned in a previous episode, their media attempts and their influence attempts have always been clunky, to say the best, in the best situations. And I guess that was one really bad screw up in terms of their general strategic thinking. And it actually left behind this very big issue until today, 2022, that the Chinese population, I'm not talking about the government or whatever, I'm just talking about the general Chinese people, the population. You have to be very careful when they ask you, 你是中国人吗？ Because to the Chinese, the term 中国人 will just mean Chinese. Whereas for example, to me, 中国人 to me means a Chinese national.
A nationality. No.
It's a nationality. It's not a race. I am a Huaren, or in Hokkien.
Yeah, I identify that as well. Huaren. Yeah.
Huaren or Teng Lang in Hokkien, even Teochews. We are Teng Lang. We are Huaren. But the Chinese population would use the term 中国人 very broadly to cover the entire Chinese population. So as long as you are black hair, yellow skin, adopts Confucian ideas and adopt Chinese traditions, you are a 中国人. So when someone say that, I have seen fights or I have heard of fights breaking out just because one party say 我不是中国人, I am not a 中国人, but 我是华人. I've heard of fights breaking out because of responses like that, and these mainland Chinese would say that, oh, so you don't recognize your ancestors, you don't recognize your roots, so you are saying that you are not Chinese. But when all we are saying is that we are not a Chinese national, we are Chinese by ethnicity. And this issue, I think the root of this issue was serious strategic miscalculation by the PRC government back in the late 90s, if I'm not wrong, or early 2000s, just when they were on the cusp of, arriving, announcing their arrival. These were things that they were doing in the background to try to garner the support of the entire Chinese diaspora behind the rise of the Chinese nation state. The idea is not wrong. It has been done before various times through history internally in China. During the Warring States period is one very famous example. But anyways, I guess the idea was a good idea and it's not wrong. It's not, in a wrong direction or whatever. It's just that sometimes, we have this saying, while the idea is noble, the execution sucks. And that was one of these very classic cases of, the execution sucking so much that they had to abandon this whole proactive tactic of garnering support from overseas Chinese diaspora, and they had to backtrack quite a lot and decided that maybe it's a better idea to just let things take its own course and not try to force it. But the problem is because of the central direction of the PRC government of the time, saying that, all Chinese are our brothers, all Chinese are our relatives, 都是我们的同胞. And so this kind of inadvertently ingrained into every Chinese mind, every mainland Chinese mind at that time, that if you are Chinese, you have to support China. And this is one very big problem even until today. That, like I say, you can start a fight just by telling a Chinese person that 我不是中国人. Because to them, 中国人 means both the
Deeply
nationality.
Divisive.
Yeah, to them, 中国人 would mean the race, not necessarily the nationality, but the race, Whereas for everyone outside of mainland China,
so there's dissonance over there.
Yeah, there's that dissonance because the race and the nationality to us is two separate stories. And I guess there's also one issue you would have if you were to grow up in a monocultural environment, a monocultural state. I mean, let's be frank here. I guess the Americans also have this problem. Because they grew up so monocultural and that's the only thing they know. I mean, you tell them something that's contrary to what they are so used to, they wouldn't accept it, immediately either. So this is the same issue, but just happening, in a different place with a different set of people. But yeah, monocultural environment, and then with a screw up from the central government that set the direction, but had to, backtrack. But then again, the influence has already been spread down into ground level already. So yeah, that was another thing. So are we a bonsai? Well, at least we are described as a bonsai this time. We've been described variously as booger, as a dot, as all kinds of things.
It's
so
an upgrade.
Yeah, being a bonsai is an upgrade. At least now we're living.
Yeah. So in the concluding paragraph of that same article, the author says, as a sovereign nation, Singapore is not a Chinese country, but it has a majority ethnic Chinese population. That is why many of Singapore's best practices are still relevant to China, and it remains an ideal role model for China, at least for some time. What do you think about this? Is there anything that China can learn from Singapore today, or have the tables turned?
Wow, that is one very big hole that you just dug there for me, man. I believe, what do you call it? We could all learn from each other. That is so politically correct. 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, China learned from Singapore, and they localized the solutions that we gave them, and it helped them grow into what they are today. And I know that a lot of the Chinese people still look at Singapore and look at old Mr. Lee as in very friendly terms, because they still feel that it is because of Singapore that China has managed to grow as it did, because we imparted our system to them. And if I'm not wrong, until now, there is still a yearly, what do you call that, group of Chinese officials from the Xian and Shi level that will come to Singapore to learn about the governance.
Yes, at NTU, I believe, the Nanyang Technological University.
Okay, so every year they will send a delegation, right, to do that. So Singapore, in a way, I believe, is like a gateway for China to tap into what's going on. I mean, of course, they have the capacity and everything to do it on themselves, on their own, but to have someone that's there, or have another third party that's there who is more familiar with the system, who has more access to the system to guide you. I think that is something that China still needs now. But that reliance is reducing more and more with every single passing year as they come up with their own system that is localized to their own problems. Because one thing we always have to remember, that we all face different problems. We all face localized problems. So one set of solution that works for one set of people or a government will not work for another situation entirely. That's why I never ever believed that the export of democracy is ever a good thing, because it might work for you, hardly, but it's definitely not working for everyone else. But then I digress. The thing is, can we learn from each other? Of course we can. We will always be learning from each other, because the Chinese would have their own innovations, and their own ideas, and they would have a lot to teach us about resilience and tenacity and how to see things through. Because if there's anything that Chinese history has taught us, is that these are a people that sees things through. And in a way, I believe that this generation of Singaporeans, our generation and the generation after us, we lost a lot of the original spirit that our pioneers and our founders had. the fire that they had in their spine. People like Hokkien, Lee Kuan Yew, and all these great people, and our father's generation, our grandfather's generation, who helped to build this nation up from nothing, if we follow the official state storyline. But the thing is, our generation and the generation after us, we don't have that anymore. We lost a lot of that because things got too comfortable. And back to what we said in the first episode, hard times make good men make good times make bad man, and bad men, blah blah blah, that cycle thing. And by looking at what China has done in the last 20 years, we could hopefully find some inspiration of what we can do moving forwards, and that is the lesson we can learn from them. These people survived through 100 years, the century of humiliation, got looked down upon by every single one in the world, and until now they are still, let's say like this, they are still treated unfairly on the global stage while they are trying their best to integrate. They are still treated extremely unfairly, but they don't give up. They just don't give up. And that is something we Singaporeans should learn. And our governing bodies and our institutions could also learn a thing or two from how they are doing things over there, their efficiency, their speed of response. Some things that we can learn, definitely. They can learn from us, we can learn from them. It's a two-way street. A
two-way street indeed. Thank you so much, RP, for spending your evening with me. This has been our longest podcast yet. This concludes episode 4 of Both Sides Now. 观望东西，聆听左右. Please stay tuned for next episode. And cut. Bye-bye.
And after that cut, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Damn it.